Thank you to all that are here, and to take a moment, to take a breath of this air, to feel this wind that comes into this space across the Potomac River and envelops us in every step that we take. Because we are in this building and we are elevated, it doesn't disconnect us from the Mother Earth beneath us. And it doesn't forget that we are also part of everything that has breathed on this land now and for time immemorial. I would like to take this moment of thanksgivings and greetings in relationship and as a Piscataway woman, to remember the people who are with us and those who are not, and also to speak their names. I would like to speak the name of the Nacotchtank people who lived here for a very, very long time. And maybe it was from the time that a woman fell from the sky onto the back of a turtle. Or maybe it was from a time when the hairs of a deer sprang up and populated the forests. But it's a very, very long time. And they were here with every smile, every tear, their speech, their breath that we still breathe, the ground that we walk on that is still in their footsteps, and that we remember them. And so to acknowledge this land as part of a system of the tidal waters, it carries a salt the way it carries our veins and our blood. And whether you've been here for thousands of years, or whether you came here voluntarily or against your will, if you're just here today, to remember that we are all part of this story, and to know that it took a very long time. It took a very long time to be asked to be engaged in an acknowledgement. And this is something that I know that so many people are grateful for, that the spirits are grateful for, and that we don't only take that memory with us, but also understand that when you acknowledge the land, and then when you acknowledge the peoples that were stewards of this land, that that's also a commitment and a relationship. It's not just a thought, it's an action. So I would like to thank you all for being here and taking this time to remember. When you walk outside, and if you get a chance, go and greet the water sometime, and thank those waters that flow by this space that you can see right out of this window. So with that, I welcome you, I thank you. It's so good and joyful to be here as we're about to engage in a very serious conversation from the heart and from the mind. May we come together as one being in this meeting. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Gabrielle Tayac's words are beautiful, and as we look out the South Transept, those of you who've had a chance to do that, at those beautiful waters, we think of those waters both as life-giving and at the same time also as having brought forms of social death to these shores. So we're gathered here in many ways this year across this nation, remembering 1619, which we use as a kind of placeholder, although there are other cases, earlier cases of enslaved peoples in North America. But it does sort of mark the beginning in British North America But we have to think of that larger period that Dr. Tayac has just reminded us. If we think of the period from the very beginning of the 17th century, even to 1619, as a kind of period of genocidal violence, which in a sense opened up the economic, social, political possibilities with the gradual removal, though not complete removal, of indigenous peoples for the importation of people of African descent. And I want to tell some aspect of that story today, thinking of in my title, In Bondage on the Heights, as we were called the enslaved families of African descent, who lived and worked on the very ground that we now occupy, with particular attention to the early decades of the 19th century. So we start with a photograph that is taken almost 3 decades after emancipation came to Washington, D.C. It's a somewhat enigmatic photograph from the Sidwell Friends archives. I should mention, in the interest of inclusivity, that while I graduated from Sidwell Friends, Fath Davis Ruffins, who we're going to hear from a moment, is a proud National Cathedral School graduate. So we have all bases covered. And as I ran cross-country on these grounds competitively many, many years ago, it had never occurred to me either the indigenous presences or the enslaved presences that were so important in shaping socially, economically, and ultimately politically the very space of the cathedral close that we're now in. So here we have a very enigmatic photograph, only identified with the words on the back, Rachel, Cooke, and her daughter, in 1885 from the Highlands. This is the area just behind what's now Zartman House at Sidwell Friends, what was known as the Highlands, part of the Nurse family estates that are so key to the story of slavery and liberation in this part of the district. And as we'll see, it's very likely that these are individuals who, some of whom were enslaved by the nurses who worked the very ground that the cathedral was built upon. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But going back in time a little bit, it's important to think about the particular position of D.C. to think a little bit about the expansion of chattel slavery in the United States. So, of course, for a long time, if we follow 1619, so there's a parallel history of destructive assaults, of course, on Native Americans, as chattel slavery, people of African descent, are engaged in a kind of second involuntary middle passage into the North American interior, coerced, with very complex relations, often with Native communities, which we might talk about a little bit later. But as you see this loop playing, it's important to remember that this area around the district, the Chesapeake, was, of course, farmed continuously for over 200 years before the ending of slavery by enslaved people. What this meant was a transformation in the local political ecology, primarily through tobacco, but other crops. So agricultural production became less effective, and in a certain horrific sense, we can say that this particular area became increasingly devoted to the growing of enslaved people who were then shipped either into the North American interior, across the Allegheny, across the Appalachians, or through maritime traffic, as you can see, going down especially into that concentrated area, Louisiana, Mississippi, the killing fields. So D.C. played a critical role, and that's very important to our story, to remember D.C. was a kind of cross point. Many enslaved people were sold, families were torn apart in the district, and even after 1850, when it became illegal to sell people in principle, much of that traffic simply moved to Alexandria. So there's a long and horrific story of families torn apart. We are all familiar, I think, with the Georgetown University story, one of just a tip of an iceberg. So with that in mind, let's talk about this area that was once known as Georgetown Heights. Outside, so we're now standing in what would have been, for much of the 1800s, what would have been unincorporated Washington County, not within the District of Columbia, but not Washington City itself. And so here we are north of Georgetown, of course, in Georgetown Heights. And this is an area which had quite a number of enslaved people on the eve of emancipation. Here are some examples of major slave owners, still prominent families, many of them deeply connected to the history of this place of worship, of course. It's a little hard to see all the numbers. This tract of land was known as Pretty Prospects. There was a lot of land speculation as Washington, D.C. was established, and George Washington and his friends were in a sense, doing a good deal of land speculation. Here are some. So I would say in this immediate area, within a few blocks, you would come to about 15 white families who owned about 120 people, and we're going to talk in particular about this property here that was owned by the beginning of the Civil War by Carolyn Nurse Delaney. We'll also talk about Rebecca Morris Nurse and enslaved people there, and so forth. So there's a long and complex history of land speculation in this area, which many people have tried to painstakingly reconstruct. And it's not clear that enslaved people themselves were physically on this particular area of land, but we know that in a sense the land was shaped through the operations of capital, of investment, and finance speculation, and that was all undergirded, as it were, through enslaved people. So Benjamin Stoddard, William Deakins, Uriah Forrest, well-known land speculators between 1795 and 1797, were all moderate slave owners. John Rosby Platter, who then acquired this land. We know a good deal about his enslaved people further down in eastern Maryland because during the War of 1812, 48 of them were liberated by a British warship and resettled in Nova Scotia. He was very upset about that and eventually sought reparations from the British for that. And we have a series of land transactions leading ultimately to Joseph Nurse acquiring this land around 1817, and at that point he brings in at least about 10 to a dozen enslaved people. And there's also a story that involves Dr. Samuel Busey, who we'll touch on in a moment. So here's a more familiar map, those of you who know this neighborhood. So here we are talking about what was then Mount Alban, Joseph Nurse, and then came out of the Nurse family control, but eventually passes to his granddaughter, Dr. Samuel Busey, a prominent physician, member of the Know Nothing Party, a notorious racist and anti-immigrant figure in 19th century Washington, and the Highlands, the current grounds of Sidwell Friends School, very closely related in terms of the enslaved people who seem to have moved back and forth between these two sites. So Joseph Nurse, of course, a legendary figure here in the district, the first register of the U.S. Treasury, served through five administrations. We know in 1800, when he's coming down from Philadelphia to help with the establishment of the federal government here in D.C., owned 6 enslaved people, according to the census. There's a fascinating story, and I will defer to David White, who's actually in the audience, who's extensively researched the early history of the Samuel Jackson property on Cedar Hill. This is Dumbarton House, of course, which is now located on Q Street, but I think was a little further down. David will correct us, but somewhere because Q Street had to be sort of, I guess, moved right through the property. So somewhere in there, that's where Joseph Nurse would have acquired, and David just shared through, it was actually through a sort of bank foreclosure, complex financial instrument or foreclosure. And so we know a number of enslaved people, thanks to the good work of the Dumbarton House staff, of course, the Colonial Dames of America headquarters. So we have a number of people, and it's always hard to tell from letters and so forth who's enslaved, who's indentured, who's being rented, because there was a great deal of renting of enslaved people in the district, renting out. But we do know for sure that Dinah, who was the cook, at least for a quarter century, there's a reference to a letter because she at one point goes out for some kind of, quote, ramble without a child, and Joseph Nurse threatens to sell her off to Georgia, which did, of course, happen a good deal. It doesn't appear to have happened. We know that Bacchus Motts was able, apparently, to acquire his own freedom in 1807. And then there are others, and we're not quite sure, but we know, of course, at least at 1800, at least of 6 or so people. Anyway, Joseph Nurse does leave. For those of you who are sort of following the story, goes up to Kalorama after he gives up that property, and then moves up here by 1817 to the area that was then pretty prospect, and he renames it Mount Alban, honoring the story, of course, of the first English martyr. So again, to sort of keep track of this, we're going to talk about 3 properties that are interlinked, that seem to have enslaved people who were probably related to one another. And the centering just here it says C.R. Delaney, Joseph Nurse's granddaughter, who owned this land and had at various times through her husband a number of enslaved people that seem to have been brought in for Virginia. And then there's Charles Josephus Nurse, the son of Joseph Nurse, also a slave owner, and then Samuel Busey, who in the years just before the Civil War acquires the territory, the land that's now Beauvoir, that's now the elementary school of the National Cathedral system. All right, so let's start with the Nurse Delaney family right around here. This is a map that's a little bit later than when our story starts. So we know that there was a farmhouse here. It may have been built by Richard Harrison, or it may not have. There's some debate about this. And so just as you were entering into the west entrance of the cathedral, apparently that's where the house was. Carolyn Rebecca Nurse was a painter. We know that by 1820, right here on this property, Joseph Nurse has 8 enslaved people, and there are 3 free people of color also living in the household. The censuses keep on changing in terms of the amount of detail that they give us, but at least we know the sexes and age and relative age spans of these individuals. We do have a bill of sale. Joseph Nurse then in 1827, and that may be a significant date, purchases one Negro woman named Anne, aged about 35, and her 5 children, to wit, William, Lee, Samuel, and Nathan. And most of those individuals don't seem to stay in the Nurse family possession, because we find them enslaved by other white slave owners in this immediate neighborhood. But at least one of them we'll see. So it seems to be a family, a mother and her children. And almost certainly, since that seems to be the year that the Highlands, the building that becomes the administrative headquarters of Sidwell Friends, that's when the Nurse Jr. family, the Charles Josephus Nurse family, really sort of sets themselves up for business in that space that seems to have been inspired a bit architecturally by Mount Vernon. There are lots of close connections between the first families and the Nurses. And there's a sort of consciousness of privilege and prestige. And part of that may well have been Joseph Nurse is probably purchasing for his son, Charles Josephus Nurse, and Rebecca Wister Morris, Nurse, his wife, who'd come down from Philadelphia, probably purchasing this enslaved family to work with them and sort of give them a start in life. And we know that because suddenly in 1830, 3 years later, Charles Josephus Nurse does have 7 slaves. And Joseph Nurse doesn't seem to have in that year any more slaves than he did before, just a natural increase of 1. By 1840, Joseph Nurse has hit very tough financial times. As many of you know, he had a falling out with the Jackson administration. Andrew Jackson seems to have not been thrilled by the thought that Joseph Nurse had, I think, at one point 15 of his relatives employed in the Treasury Department, and one of his campaign promises was to clean out the nursery, as he called it. And so what that means is we're not exactly sure, though, what happens to those enslaved people. Are they sold off? I haven't yet seen records of this. Are they transferred perhaps to another property? The Nurses owned a great deal of land through what's now Rock Creek Park and so forth, most of which ends up in different kinds of financial entanglements with the bank. But by early 1840s, the property then slowly falls out of the control of the Nurse family. There's the establishment by the mid-1840s of the St. John Institute for Boys, a kind of forerunner of St. Albans. And Reverend Anthony Ten Brook is then brought down from Orange, New Jersey to sort of give the school a second go as the principal and the director, to serve as rector. And that period is quite important, as we know, to the history of what becomes the cathedral close. Phoebe Nurse, who is one of the daughters who's growing up here, when she dies relatively early, she leaves a bequest for a church she hopes on Alban Hill, said to be inspired by Anthony Ten Brook. And then Carolyn Delaney, the Nurse Delaney, the granddaughter of Joseph Nurse, does give at least a half acre for St. Albans Church. It's a very familiar story, but it is interesting. There's another angle which I don't think we've reflected on before. Now, so here's, as he's setting up St. John's Institute, that becomes the educational forerunner, and in a sense, along with the church at St. Alban, the free church, the free Episcopal Church, becomes a sort of foundation and inspiration for the eventual founding, of course, of this beautiful cathedral. So his labor, the labor that he's depending on to sort of keep everything running in these two institutions, primarily men and women from Ireland. But then if you go over to now a separate document, which is the slave schedule for 1850, you'll see there he is, Anthony ten de Broek, and he does in fact own one enslaved woman, listed as a female, 30 years old, black, born, as to say, around 1820. I've not been able to find anything else, but we know certainly that that woman was here and was heavily involved, probably both in the church and in this ecclesiastical school that's the forerunner of really everything that is to happen here. So that's sort of interesting to think about. And the very funding, of course, that leads to the vestry, that leads to this first church that then sort of inspires the coming of the cathedral, is obviously made possible through the uncompensated work of enslaved individuals. Some of this history will be familiar to many of you. Commodore Beladen Tasker Delaney in the U.S. Navy then purchases the property. Carolyn, the granddaughter of Joseph Nurse, does an advantageous marriage. He's able to acquire this property, bring it back into the family. And at that point, the evidence is a group of enslaved people are brought up from Fauquier County in Virginia, part of the extensive Delaney holdings. The Delaneys are both in Maryland and in Virginia. When he dies in 1856, Carolyn acquires the property, about 29 acres at that point, and at least a life share in some of the enslaved people. So we know a good deal about them, actually, thanks to the 1860s slave schedule. There's 7 enslaved people. We know their ages and relative colorations. And then in the district, as many of you know, we have more knowledge than practically any knowledge that we have of the other 4 million enslaved people of African descent in the United States. Because in 1862, Congress decided, of course the Civil War was already underway, decided to engage in a form to require emancipation of all enslaved people in the district, more or less, and then to retain the loyalty of their white owners, many of whom had Confederate sympathies. Congress voted some payment, some compensation. But to get that compensation, you had to fill out all sorts of forms indicating the names, the ages, distinguishing physical characteristics, and in some cases the skill sets. So it's an invaluable for those who work on African American genealogy, the DC part of the story. And if we match them up, here we have Fanny Brown, who's 32, and what appear to be her children, Mary Brown, Sarah Brown, Louisa Brown, Lucy, Walter, Rose, and then Winifred Meade, who may not be related. Per se, we have a family group that we know is here. We can match it up almost exactly with the 1860 census. There's a missing 10-year-old girl, and then there's a boy and a little girl who has been born since the 1860 census. But we see quite a nice matchup. And so at least we know those names of individuals who were unquestionably right on this property and enslaved. Let's move up a little bit, up to a little north to Sidwell Friends, to the Highlands, which was constructed between 1817 and 1827 by Joseph Nurse's son, Charles Josephus Nurse, we are assuming that enslaved people played a role in the construction of that house, though we don't have direct evidence of that very beautiful house. Which many of you are familiar, right? And here is James Nurse, the grandson of Joseph Nurse, who lived there for a long time with Mary Nurse. And here we have another view of the Highlands, of course, the administration building of Sidwell. So we know by 1830, Charles Josephus Nurse is at the Highlands. He has 7 enslaved people. And by 1840, he has 4 slaves. But it doesn't mean that that's the extent of his holdings. That's what's listed in the census as residing there. And it's quite possible that others have been rented out around the district, especially skilled labor. That was an important income source for many white slave owners in Georgetown, in the Georgetown Heights area and in Georgetown itself. 1840, by this point, Joseph Nurse has really hit very tough financial times. There are no enslaved people, and he's going to die the year later. But here's where it gets interesting. 1850, we have 4 enslaved people up at the Highlands, and these are interrelated almost certainly with enslaved people who worked on this property here. But we also have 2 men of color, free men of color, William Brooks, a coachman, and Anthony Hutchinson. And the interesting thing is, William Brooks is just about the right age, and there are a few hints that he may well have been, if you recall, in that sale back in 1827, there was a will, and there's some evidence that, in fact, this is the same Will, William Brooks, who's now free. Now, when we fast forward to 1860, if you can bear with me for a moment, we now see something very interesting. There are a whole new group of free people of color, Sarah Brooks and what appear to be a group of children, Theodore William, David Brooks, Margaret, John, and but we're not sure where William Brooks is at this point, but he does show up 2 years later in the most surprising way, because while these appeals are listed as being free, there's no pre-1860 emancipation papers anywhere in the district files, which the district was pretty good about keeping track of that because they were enormously anxious about free people of color who they thought might be a risk to the public order. That's what the white leadership, the white power structure thought. But there in 1862, look who's applying for compensation from Congress for the enslaved people that he owned. It's William Brooks himself, this free man of color, and he is asking for money for Sarah Brooks and all the children. So presumably he had managed over the years to purchase from the white nurse family, his own family, but he hadn't actually gotten around to filing anything yet. So he decides in 1862, it makes financial sense, presumably, to seek compensation. But you can see, if you look very carefully down here, Sarah Brooks has also written her name there as saying that she has rights to this money. And then it gets pointed out to her, no, she's still enslaved, although she's thought of herself as free for several years. And so she's crossed out so that all the money will go to her husband. And the extra money for her, which was several $100s, goes into the family coffers. It's quite illustrative of the narrow and sort of fuzzy line that existed between the statuses of slavery and freedom in the district, especially post-1850. It was a very terrifying time. There were some privileges associated with being technically free, but slave catchers were constantly coming in, creating sometimes ludicrous claims, asserting that people were fugitives and re-enslaving them. So the story, of course, of Solomon Brown, 12 Years a Slave, is just one of many. And it gives you an idea of this very shadowy lines between slavery and freedom. So it is fascinating, I find, that he's seeking a compensated emancipation. Now let's just quickly move over just to where Beauvoir is, to Dr. Samuel Busey, who acquires this property just behind where we're standing now, the very lovely elementary school now, around 1850, and gradually builds a very grand Italianate mansion. Here, again, we assume there was enslaved labor involved, and he does have a number of, so we're looking now, this is the construction of the cathedral, so back towards Reno Road, we're seeing the property. We know that by 1860, he has 8 enslaved people whom he owns, and again, we're able to identify almost all of them by name through several means, because 2 years later, he seeks compensated emancipation for having liberated them, and the names almost exactly match. The ages almost exactly match. There are a couple missing things, though. If you notice, there was a 33-year-old female mulatto and a 19-year-old male. We don't know where they are. Of course, there's a little boy who's now been born, Prince Rhodes. All right, so we probably are looking at, on this property that are just behind us, 2 enslaved families that were female-headed. And we don't know where that missing 33-year-old female is. Now, we do have a hint. Dr. Busey wrote a famous sort of autobiographical sketch of Washington and talked about the wonderful days before the coming of the Civil War, surrounded by, it was idyllic up here, he said, in the area that later became, sort of cathedral close and Cleveland Park. I was surrounded by willing servants and hired laborers to do my bidding, but once the war came, household servants disappeared, and farmhands could not be attained at any price. So we're wondering, who are these individuals? The 33-year-old mother, for example. Well, interestingly enough, and here I'm very grateful to our friends at the Anacostia Museum Library, who have copies of the Washington, D.C. jail records, because on 1861, September 27th, that is to say, the Civil War has started, but it's still another 7-8 months before compensated emancipation is going to happen. In the D.C. jail, which was largely used for housing escaped or self-liberated people, enslaved people, it's a little hard to see, but it says Margarita Beale, or Bean, and Dr. Busey is placing her there for, quote, safekeeping, a technique that was often used to sort of terrorize enslaved people who had either made claims on certain rights, like petitions for freedom, or refused to follow orders or tried to escape. And he's paying $4.74 when he brings her out of jail. So we suspect he tried to free herself. We don't know who her husband is. There's an Alfred who Dr. Busey had inherited. Perhaps he was here still. There's another fugitive, the D.C. slave, topped up to Busey. I'll just wrap things up in a moment. And this is William Hawkins, who's delivered to Samuel Busey. It's strange because William Hawkins was owned actually down in the district by Charles H. Wilberger, a silver merchant. But clearly he's probably rented out here for a while as one of those farmhands, enslaved farmhands. I have a theory, which we can talk about later, about who was the father of the other family, probably over from the Pierce Klingel estate, Lydian. But anyway, moving ahead. I'll just quickly, we do have some sense the Beals themselves, that enslaved family of Dr. Busey that worked here again, we do see them showing up in various censuses in Tenleytown and around here. And the Brooks themselves, that William Brooks, who got compensation for essentially freeing his own family, shows up in Tenleytown, just up the road, in 1870. He's in the Northeast. So it seems likely that Rachel, who's in this picture here, was probably the woman listed as Rachel Oliver in the 1870 census, living with the Brooks family. She's probably Rachel Jackson, who had been owned at least in as late as 1862 by Mary Ann Clark, who lived just down Wisconsin in Calvert, just across the street. And so there's probably a lot of renting and so forth. So families are being, I think what's interesting about this picture is it reminds us that in the immediate post-emancipation period, families are, African American families are reuniting themselves and reconstituting a new way of being. And all of these families are closely connected and so forth. We have many tantalizing hints, which we could talk about exactly how everybody's interrelated. But the key thing is, we can at least say with great confidence, these names of 30 persons who were enslaved right here on Mount St. Albans, and whose labor did contribute to the establishment of this particular ecclesiastical institution and the schools over time. And I think it's important, it's of course enormously important, we're going to hear from a moment, again from Gabrielle Tayac, remembering the long history of indigenous presence here. And we should also honor these 30 names and the many who are still unnamed, enslaved people and then freed people of African descent, whose work was so long uncompensated and whose names were unrecognized. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I'm back to talk more about details, but thank you so much, Mark, for that incredibly rich evidentiary presentation. And I'd also like to just give a moment to thank you, Fath Ruffins, for being here. You are a maestra, and when we get a chance to talk more, you'll see how much the histories are also interlinked between indigenous peoples and African American peoples. for a very, very long time. And actually, Ms. Ruffins, you were the person who I think blew that cover for me maybe more than anybody else. So really quite incredible. So I'm going to take us back, and we're going to do about a quick 10,000 years in a few minutes. But because the issue of erasure is so deep and so intensive and actually so intentional, it's important to go through some basic facts about the people that were here and are still here. So Piscataway, which means where the waters blend, was a confederacy, a chiefdom actually, with a central chief. And it was the Anacostan people who were right up to the point of their tribal dissolution, affiliated to and then absorbed into the living people of whom I am a member. So to take us through the Piscataway over time, let me just see if I can move us. Yay. Okay, good. So looking at, Piscataway Origins. Now, one of the basic Indians 101, we're talking about thousands of different peoples, thousands of years, many different cultures. Think Europe, think Africa, think Asia, so there's no way to collapse all of it, and it is so unknown for so many reasons. But bringing us right to this place, Piscataway are Algonquian speakers, and this is the largest language family in North America. It's like it's a language that's spoken throughout the Atlantic seaboard, goes all the way up into Saskatchewan with some little pockets here and there. So very large language family. A chiefdom, as I said, with a central chief, and also have a history that goes back quite far. Actual social history, aside from the fact that there were people that were living here for 8,000 to 10,000 years at least, there was a social organization that came over from the eastern shore of Maryland, about 13 generations from the entry of the Ark and the Dove. It was said that a chief named Utapoingasinum crossed over and established this government that was here. So in terms of known history, that's something that we do know. And it's the original population of Maryland. So I'm not sure if I have a little pointer, but anyway, that's basically, you can see the map of the Chesapeake Bay with Washington, D.C., and the different peoples that were part of that, part of the chiefdom that go from basically Point of Rocks, follow the Potomac River all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay, and that is our territory going over into the Patuxent, with the idea is that it's also very porous. You know, borders they're not like they are now, and that's why sometimes we see them, and I certainly see them as quite artificial. Native Society to 1634, we're talking about villages, towns, settlements that are semi-permanent, and the idea of land not just being a place that you own or that is a resource, but that you are in living relationship with. Our peoples lived in everything from the stockaded villages, as you see here, with long houses that went along matrilineal lines. This is a painting that was done by John White in 1585 in what is today North Carolina. These paintings are associated with the lost colony of Roanoke, and you see, if you do this kind of history, you actually see them quite a lot, but they're representative of the peoples that were here. Our peoples lived in extended families and clans. My clan is Beaver, so we actually see ourselves as interconnected, related, and descended from beavers, which are really kind of cool rodents that build and take care of their families and are very busy. And so there's other clans that have existed, and sometimes right now it's just a memory. But this gives you a little view of what a longhouse would have looked like. Our people did not live in teepees. Teepees are really great. No disrespect to teepees, but teepees are in another location. So these are long houses that were taken care of by a matriline, by a mother, and that the man, if he married into the family, would move into the mother's home, into the matriline. And if he was not acting right, his stuff could just be put outside of the longhouse, and that's the end of it. So thinking about suffrage, which we're dealing with some anniversaries, that was quite in practice here. And under terms of understanding the forest, these lands that we look at right now, they were 95% old growth forest. 95% old growth forest, and that's a very different kind of woodland than what we see now, which is generally secondary growth. It means that it is a place that holds on to the waters, onto the silts, so the waters and the rivers are not wide and muddy the way they look now, but they are quite clear. This is a spirit that took care of the animals for the men. And the men took on different leadership positions. This is a bowman that it was also drawn in 1585. They could be war chiefs, they could be peace chiefs, they could be counselors. And then women as well were actually quite powerful. Not powerful in terms of dominance, but powerful in terms of influence. They provided 70% of the food. They were related to the plant and agricultural worlds and the wild plant worlds. They were healers, clan mothers. They could be councilwomen, and they could also be chiefs and carried the title Warawansqua. There was, in Port Tobacco and in Pamunkey, there were women chiefs in those locations. As I mentioned before, we see the rivers as veins of Mother Earth rather than dividers. They're connectors. And this man here is a man who was a descendant of our people from those that ended up having to move up into Canada. His name was Jake Thomas, and he's carrying something called a wampum belt, which shows two rivers flowing side by side. But our world did change, and it changed drastically. And the world had always changed, but it changed in terms of, like apocalyptic, catastrophic change. Really with the entry of the Spanish in the 1500s, the Roanoke settlement in 1585, and then constant, just nonstop, forever, never go back, we have to deal with you forever. Jamestown 1607, which was an economic enterprise, and thinking about the linkage of African people in 1619 and Native people, Jamestown really clinched that. So that, as my Hopi colleague Angela Gonzalez talks about, our oppressions come from the notion that Native peoples had property and that African peoples were considered to be property. And so it's that interconnection which I think is a fundamental driver of what happens. We have the Ark and the Dove, and people lose titles. So King Charles deeded to Lord Baltimore all of our territory without us ever even knowing who he was, without even ever seeing him, put it in a title 1632. They show up here 1634, and on paper, everything is apparently gone. The losses were intense. Often we talk about epidemics, wiping out Native peoples, but the Black Plague was a real problem in Europe. There are a lot of Europeans. So the thing is that there are other forces involved. This is a stained glass, which is still in the site of the original conversion to Catholicism in July of 1640 of our chief Kittamakind with Father Andrew White, whose records are the only surviving written records of our language, which are at Georgetown. So our voices are there. Our peoples were brought into subjugation. There were warfare and militia. There were so many people that passed and so much that happened, as you were talking about, sometimes that slips off the record, right? Like we see a little bit of it, we see some of it, but then if somebody does actually want to ask, is there Was there genocide? And I'll just say, why am I up here having to tell you who Piscataway people are? It's just a reality that we don't speak Piscataway today, that there is such an incredible erasure, and that is something that didn't just happen. Native people didn't just float off into the, mystic world. Stuff happened. So we have the seizure of lands and a diaspora of our peoples. Many went up into Pennsylvania, which was seen as a red and white brotherhood state initially, and it all sounded like a really good idea until the French and Indian War, when war was declared on all Native people, and it was a genocidal erasure as well. And people ended up into what they called the Old Northwest. They ended up in Canada, still carrying our names, some into Oklahoma. But I actually descend from the people who stayed on the land. And whereas we have a history that you can see across Native America with the invasions, the epidemics, the missionization, the reservation systems, all of those processes happen, but they're pretty much done by 1712. And then what we have here, which is so distinctive, and this is a location that's called St. Ignatius Church, where my family still goes to Mass on Sundays, is the entry of race law. And so our people that started out actually intermarrying very early in the 1680s with the children of generally indentured white women and enslaved Africans who were on our Indian manors and that we married into, and we still carry their surnames. Proctor, Butler, Swan, if you have one of those, if you have one of 7 surnames and you're from down in Port Tobacco, it's like, I know who's your daddy. Like, everybody's like, who's your people? I'm like, I know you. So we know each other, and it comes from this very early piece, but then it also comes from an issue where we got locked in as an island, because of race law. And it's very distinctive here on the Atlantic. And it's something that our people actually need to understand more. And so when we have this conversation today, these histories are deeply interlinked. Our reservations were dissolved precisely because they were found that the people living on them had, as what was quoted, we had degraded into Negroes. James Mooney wrote of us in 1911 in the Catholic Encyclopedia that we were now just a few Negro mongrels left. And so that makes our community feel shame and be silenced. And it also blocks us off from our African ancestors. So our conversations today are very key in terms of healing and not just in terms of historic consciousness raising. A whole lot happened after that. We also have to thank the restoration and revivals that somebody, generally a woman, might have woken up every day and she remembered who she was, and she cooked the hominy, and she told people who they were. And that's why we know who we are, because of those small moments that happened until the time when there were the big moments of the movements that were also inspired by our African American relatives. So at this point, I'd like to close, and we'll get into more of a conversation. But I wanted you to have a scope of who we're talking about when we get into this conversation that'll go forward now. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's good to see all of you here, and thank you for these 2 wonderful presentations, and more than very informative. I'm looking forward to leading us now into sort of the second act of our afternoon, and that is our panel discussion, and to which we will dig even more deeply into shared histories and what it means to be telling these stories. As a segue to that, I would like to provide sort of a wider frame as to what brought us here, or what brings us here even to this moment. from the doctrine of discovery in 1493 to manifest destiny and the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. We are talking about policies and laws that have suggested that certain people have a divine right to land at the expense of other peoples. There is perhaps no book that better articulates the underlying ideology of these various doctrines than Protestant clergyman Josiah Strong's 1885 publication called Our Country, Its Possible Future and Its Present Crisis. In this book, Reverend Strong makes a case for America's divine calling by first recognizing, and I quote him, that every race which has deeply impressed itself on the human family has been representative of some great ideal, end quote. But he quickly points out that the Anglo-Saxon race has been representative of at least two great ideas. He says that they are representative of two great ideas, that of civil liberty and pure spiritual Christianity. Therefore, he goes on to explain that this race of people who have not simply a divine right, but a divine mission to rule and civilize the world. Or, as he puts it, they have a divine right and a divine mission to be brother's keeper to all other races of people. Now, lest you mistake being a brother's keeper as a charitable notion, Strong quickly points out that to be a brother's keeper is to do one's best to help other races to survive by impressing upon them Anglo-Saxon ways and culture. If they are unable to adapt, he argues, to those ways, then their extinction is certain. To be sure, if people believe themselves to be chosen by God because of their way of life and the fact that they are superior to others, then the ideal of acting as their brother's keeper is inevitable. Now, Strong's book engaged more than just an elite crowd of academicians and fellow clergy. It quickly sold in this country more than 200,000 copies. The popularity of the book indicated that it strongly resonated with America's collective identity. It spoke to the Anglo-Saxon white America's sense of what it meant to be a people chosen by God for a special mission to the world. This was a mission that started in North America, most especially in the United States. Now, it is important to understand that within the manifest destiny narrative, land and race are intricately and always connected. One's right to land was dependent upon being of the right race. And this is what brings us to this discussion today. For how was the presence of the Native Americans and African peoples to be reconciled with the narratives of manifest destiny? This question is answered for us in a speech that Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton, some of you may know some of his artwork, gave before Congress in 1846. I'll read an extended quote from that speech. He proclaimed this in the halls of Congress. He said, "It would seem that the white race alone received the divine command to subdue and replenish the earth. For it is the only race that has obeyed it, the only one that hunts out new and distant lands and even a new world. Starting from Western Asia, taking Europe for their field and the sun for their guide, and leaving Mongolians behind," he said, "they arrived after many ages on the shores of the Atlantic, which they lit up with the lights of science and religion, and adored with the useful and elegant arts. 3.5 centuries ago, he says, this race, in obedience to the great command, arrived in the New World and found new lands to subdue and replenish. Civilization or extinction, he says, has been the fate of all people who have found themselves in the track of the advancing whites, and civilization always gives preference to the whites and has been pressed as an object, while extinction has followed as a consequence of all who would resist. The black and the red race, he said, have often felt this ameliorating influence. End quote. What Congressman Benton's remarks make clear is another defining feature of Manifest Destiny policies. It was not just about land and race. It was also about life. Those who had the right to land were also those who had the right to live. If the manifest vision was the expansion of Anglo-Saxonism from east to west, then those who did not capitulate to Anglo-Saxon ways were destined to become extinct. Benton was clear. It was whites who had the right to land and life. Others were eligible for extinction, that is, elimination. And so it is, as historian Reginald Horseman explains, quote, by 1850, the emphasis was on the American Anglo-Saxons as a separate, innately superior people who were destined to bring good government, commercial property, and Christianity to the American continents and to the world. This was a superior race, and inferior races were doomed to subordinate status or extinction. And so here we are today, discussing not simply the legacy of this history that was about stolen lands and stolen lives, but how to respond to that legacy, even as we speak the truth about it. And of course, it is, as we have just heard, fitting that we would be here in this discussion at the National Cathedral, not only because religion has played a legitimating role in the taking of lands and lives, but because the cathedral sits on land that is a part of the story of stolen lands, stolen labor, and stolen lives. And so now I will invite to the platform, back to the platform, Dr. Gabrielle Tayac, Dr. Mark Auslander, and welcome to the platform, Ms. Fath Ruffins, and we will continue our discussion. Well, again, I want to thank each of you for being here with us for this important conversation, which I hope is only the beginning of many conversations, and I know the beginning of many conversations that we are having here at Washington National Cathedral. Let us jump right in as we have a short time. I want to begin by addressing one question that I hope each of you will answer. Some have suggested that we are now in this moment of post-truth, not in the sense that truth doesn't matter, but in the sense that we are reevaluating the truths we thought we knew, such as reevaluating the truths of our history. And so this has meant telling the stories that have been left out or marginalized. Yet for me, telling the truth of our history is about more than simply including excluded and marginalized voices. It is about shifting perhaps the perspectives of our history, perhaps decentering the story of colonizing, enslaving culture. And so my question to each of you is, what does it mean for you to tell the truth of our history, and what would that look like? Ms. Ruffins, I'll start with you.
Is this on? Okay, good. I'm a historian, trained as a historian by, similarly to Gabby Tayac, and I spent the last 38 years working in the National Museum of American History. And so this is a question that we confront all of the time, which is what to say about the past. And I think the first thing to say is that The past is extremely complex. It's not simple. And many of us went to school, and I went to elementary and secondary school beginning to be more than 50 years ago. And the history that I was taught in elementary and less secondary school, because I did go to the National Cathedral School, was a simple story, you know, that sort of made a lot of sense. But as new research has been done, as people have asked new questions about old research, as the voices of, yes, historically marginalized people have been heard, and as we come to understand that we can't understand the United States or the world, but let's just say the United States today unless we understand those historical complexities. That simple story doesn't explain to us how we got here. And if we really want to understand how we got to the moment that we're in right now, we have to understand those historical complexities. And in that sense, it's not simply adding the stories of marginalized people, although that is true. It's also making a more accurate version of the past. I hesitate sometimes to say marginalized because, for example, the stories of women also had been left out, and women are, generally speaking, in most populations, the majority. So it's not simply the number of people. It has to do with the kinds of stories, the kinds of simplicities, who got left out of the simple story. But if we want to understand the complex story, to understand the complex America that we are in today, we have to understand those, we have to hear those more complex and more accurate stories.
Thank you.
Thanks. You know, I guess I come at that question these days through being a museum director, and I'm thinking a lot about the vital importance, as important as the recovery of the names and the basic statistics are, which is key for the sort of groundwork. Ultimately, in the museum world, I think we can't move forward in terms of sort of reimagining the history and what history is and producing usable pasts without art. And you know, you mentioned the relationship between Thomas Hart Benson, the original racist and imperialist senator of the 1840s from Missouri, and his great nephew, for whom he was named, Thomas Hart Benson, who was a wonderful progressive artist, right? And what he does in his art, especially his great murals, is exactly the work we all need to be doing, which is that he's reimagining what the American land is. Yeah, so he's constantly sort of moving. The land itself becomes a great character in all his work, especially the great murals, in which people of color, Native American people, I mean, there's still things we can critique and we do in class, but it's still remarkable what the project was, which was understanding that the land shaped and was shaped by a vast multitude of different kinds of variegated voices. And I do feel, again, sort of wearing my museum hat, that's what takes so many of our community partners into a new place. This important work in the archives I would never undervalue. It's foundational to everything we do. But ultimately, I feel like we're casting it on to the artists, the poets, the dancers, the musicians, and so forth, who are really going to create a new kind of consciousness that reconnects us to those profound voices that were never, and this is, I think, Gabby's point, were never fully extinguished, and that the great work of art is to force us to be attentive to presences that have always been there but are so easily neglected. And that's the work of developing relations of reciprocity and partnership between the living and the dead, which require listening to the stories the land has to tell us. And I think it's only the artists who can really take us there.
Truth is cultured. You know, truth is cultured. What it is that we decide is truth, and what is told and what is heard and what is uplifted, it is a cultural influencing choice. And that, to me, is something that I've really been exploring more about what is the anthropology of Anglo-Saxon choice, of whiteness, so that we have certain kinds of stories told or not, and in a certain way. The emphasis on property, for example, that you have to go into accounting records to understand what actually happened, and that becomes the glimpse of a life and a set of interactions, which is so much more. If we just looked at ourselves as our tax return, what would that really say about you? Of course, it would be very interesting to see what certain tax returns might say, but you know, I spent the past years, but especially took a deep dive in the past 2 years to look at histories from those who carry it within their expressed cultural practice, indigenous elder women who carry this, and they don't only carry it in memory, but they carry it in maybe what they're weaving, or what, as you're talking about, Mark, about what is important, and sometimes what they have to say, and to get that to be accepted as fully validated on a par with an accounting record has really been something that I've found very difficult as a historian, and that's where we have to get to that moment of all of these, you know, the policy, the political, the accounting, but what is really our understanding from what's going on internally in the voices that we're trying to recover. And that's an entire history that is so invisible to us.
Yeah, no, thank you. I want to follow up on some things that each of you said, and please feel free to jump in and follow up and with each other if you would like. But let's stick with this thing of history and histories that are told and histories that are not told, and reflecting upon something that you spoke about in your presentation, and that is the history of relationships between African Americans and Native American peoples. There is this interaction and this long history, some good in some good ways and in some not so good ways. I think, for instance, of Bacon's Rebellion, right, of 1676, I believe it was, and some of us didn't even learn about Bacon's Rebellion, and if we did learn about Bacon's Rebellion, it was quote unquote a whitewashed version of Bacon's Rebellion. But Bacon's Rebellion, this time when indentured white servants come together with African peoples in protest and rebellion against the governor, but in so doing, they attack and extinguish Native Americans in the land. And then there's the good stories, if you say, that we often have no knowledge about. So you think of the Mildred Loving case, and the Loving versus the state of Virginia. And of course that, when was it? In 1967, it was the Loving decision. But what many people don't realize is that Mildred Loving was not only African American, if you will, but was also Rappahannock. And so that Loving decision was also a response, if you will, to the 1924 Racial Identity Act that, as you alluded to, in fact made it illegal not only to intermarry, but it made it illegal to be Native American. And so that's a long way of asking you, what are the ways in which we can begin to recount not the histories of oppressed and subjugated peoples in relationship to their oppressors and their subjugators and their colonizers and slavers, et cetera, but in relationship to one another, like Native Americans and African peoples, and that relationship of history has been lost.
Yeah, so that's the complexity, and thank you for bringing up both of those examples, and the willingness for, I think so much of it is also embedded in the willingness for all parties to understand that we all had a hand within a structure that might have lent to the oppression of each other, but it was in a construct that was not always of our own choosing, right? So I think that there's that level of getting past guilt and moving into accountability and eye-opening. And when you have that sort of, if you have that ethic, then when you do approach a story like Bacon's Rebellion, which ended up practically annihilating the Doeg people right here, and then inspired a series of other laws that led to all kinds of horrific racial closures, right? So that we weren't able to see each other. I think that is, it is a pattern of an abuser to limit the vision, so that you can't being a fully enacting human being means that you also account for your error, right? That's maturity. So I think that's where I think that's where we are, because what we've classically had in these kinds of conversations between Native American and African American history, up until very recently, even within the African and Native American communities, one would say, well, the Cherokees were slaveholders, and then Native people would say, well, then you guys were, buffalo soldiers, and then it all just goes
spirals downward,
right? Yeah. So the point is that now we are at this moment where we look at seeing a complete history, and it does help us to it really does help us to understand where we are. The strands of what we're seeing now in politics, these are very, very old. That's right. Very old practices and life perspectives that are driving the ethic that we see at this moment.
You wanted to say?
It's there are so many things to say, but I guess I'll start in response to two. Bacon's Rebellion, of course, is a historical event that very few people actually know much about, but it points to the kinds of relationships that are very complex to understand. You have indentured white people and some indentured black people, but many more enslaved black people who joined together in an effort to take down the colonial government. However, in the resulting fighting, it's actually the native people in that specific area in Virginia that are decimated. So this points to a problem that I often see in public settings, which is none of us who are sitting here did that. Okay? We do all inherit it because we inherit everything that happened in the United States. But we don't necessarily have to defend these people as if they were our immediate relatives, okay? This is history that happened long ago. And we could learn from this, and we can come to understand this better, understand how it's structured a certain set of relationships that we have today. And by learning from that, perhaps we can choose to do differently in the future. But we don't have to defend the past as if we were making that choice today. That's the first thing. The second thing to say is that it's really difficult, I find often for younger people to realize that the people in the past had to make choices, and they didn't know what was going to happen. We know what happened as a result of certain things, but they didn't know what was going to happen. So they had to make their own choices in a very, very complex situation in which there is often a great deal of violence. These are not just, it's not just, if you have the impression that all that happened where the founding fathers were sitting in lovely Independence Hall debating with each other, that's actually not very much of what happened in American history. There's a tremendous amount of turmoil and churning and violence of many people against each other. And that is difficult to to come to grips with, but we need to come to grips with that because that has something to do with where we are today. Last thing I want to say is to talk a little bit about culture, which Mark brought up, because culture, I do think, can be, cultural expressions can be a bridge between people in a way that perhaps in history, individual stories have to be the bridge. That's part of the importance of learning about from the archives, is that these are actually individuals who are caught in a circumstance. And how would you feel if you were caught in that circumstance? To bring out the humanity, rather than just sort of a mass, you have actual human beings who are caught in a circumstance. Two, I would say that a lot of those individuals came together to form various kinds of cultural expressions. And one of the most interesting things about African American culture is that although many African American people today remain discriminated against in certain ways, many aspects of African American culture, such as music, but also forms of political activity, have come to influence the entire world. Isn't that fascinating? It's not simply that the people who are in control run everything. That there are things about that are true. Having power does make a difference, but there is a kind of power that comes from cultural expression. And I think talking about that power and how that interrelates can also help lead us to a more complete understanding of the past.
There's so many things that I could follow up on in that, but I see we've got a little bit of time, so I want to build on that and take a little turn, and that is with you, Mark. Is we talk about how do we begin to build bridges, right? And how do we really begin to really hear each other's story and not be blameworthy and blame and et cetera, et cetera. So, Mark, you talk about in your book the accidental slaveholder, right? And you tell this fascinating story of Miss Kitty, and I can't remember the bishop's name. There's always some bishop involved in being a slave owner. This time it was a Methodist bishop, so phew. There are plenty of Episcopal slave owners to go around. But you tell this fascinating story of them, and not to get into the details of it because of time, but you talk about how to sort of the legacy of that story for the African American community. They see that story one way, and for the white community, they see that story another way. You know, he is the accidental slave owner. An African American say, "How can you be an accidental slave owner?" And you know, and he at least he did let her stay on his land, and the African Americans are like, "Really?" So. And so you talk about the mythic imagination that it unlocks the enigmas of our history, right? And myth, almost the way we talk about it in religion, unlocking mystery. But you allow for people having different mythic imaginations. So my question becomes, how do you adjudicate between two different mythic imaginations? Doesn't one point to the truth and another maybe not?
Right. So so that that's the $64,000 question. But I think there is a way, as we've tried to suggest, to take seriously human collective imaginations, the mythological imagination, the stories that we tell, but also insist ultimately that there still is historical accuracy. There are better arguments that can be made, better analyses, and so forth. But an interesting example, I mean, you mentioned the history of Methodism, but taking this particular house of worship can be thought of as one of the most interesting sites of struggle and conflict, in the American landscape. So not only the history we just talked about, but especially post-1896, post the construction of the cathedral. So the cathedral, in many ways, in terms of sort of the dominant Anglo-Saxon imagination, was understood. The reason that it more or less runs on the east-west axis is that it was understood as a form of sectional reconciliation, which meant that it was going to bind together the nation's post-Civil War wounds by facing, as it were, sort of north and south. But that, of course, was predicated on that what north-south reconciliation meant was that northern and southern whites, the one thing they could agree on as the new century started was the color bar and the disenfranchisement of people of color, especially in the South, but increasingly throughout the whole country. So that obviously happened in Methodism, but the Episcopal Church was part of that story too, but was also, ironically, providing many of the very tools, going back to Scripture, of liberation and critique. So I think from the moment pretty much the first stones were laid in this structure, it was a field of profound conflict, in which, on the one hand, the historical forces that lead to the famous Lee-Jackson section, the windows that face forever south towards Virginia, that in effect, or the South that was never really conquered, all of that was predestined, in a sense, in the first 50 years of the cathedral's history, but then becomes intensified post-1948 with the rise of the Dixiecrats and the enormous central question as to whether or not the nation is going right after World War II, after a war against fascism, to live up to its founding principles and extend the franchise to the South, or is it going to basically forestall the civil rights movement for another 20 years, which is what happened. So that's what leads Dwight Eisenhower, in his attempt to appease the Dixiecrats, to essentially preside over the placement of those stained glass windows. But at the same time, there are all sorts of other amazing things that are happening. And some of my dad's here, and some of my earliest memories are coming to anti-war and civil rights events right here within this cathedral space, including Bernstein's, performance of Mass in Time of War, right? I mean, so I think that's what's interesting. Yes, culture, but let's not forget politics, because ultimately these houses of faith are profound sites of the most important generative struggles that echo much older struggles about sovereignty and dignity, which certainly go back to the very beginning of the 17th century.
We have less than 2 minutes, probably 1 minute and 45 seconds. So much more to ask. So I'm going to ask this quickly, and if you can give it requires more than 30 seconds, but a 30-second answer, and you're going to say, this is unfair. Playing from what each of you have said. So as we leave today, what does repair, restoration, or reparations look like? I know it's easy. Come on. What would you say that looks like? Anyone can jump right in, because I know you got a good answer.
Well, one thing I would say is that repair and reconciliation are extraordinarily complex, and we have some examples, such as the reconciliation and truth communities that were in South Africa. So we do have some models from around the world about how to think about this and what to do. But some people would say that before we come to that reconciliation, we need a conciliation before we get to reconciliation. That we need to have a shared understanding of the past that is where we can call it repair, but in fact it's coming to a fuller understanding, and that those two things, in my mind, are very crucial. You can't discuss, it seems to me, reparations without talking about repair and reconciliation. And I don't know that any of us know where any of these things will lead to, but I think that engaging in that work is crucial.
Yeah, absolutely, and it looks different from where one sits. So as a recovering white guy, I spent a lot of time thinking of this, and certainly the work of repair requires an enormous amount of critical self-reflection, but most important, engagement, and can only happen in this. I come out of the Jewish tradition, but there's a lot to be said for commentaries about grace and the extension of grace, the willingness to listen to one another, to hold off on immediate judgment, which doesn't mean which doesn't mean that you don't ultimately make judgment, but to be willing to allow different voices to be heard and to make mistakes. That is, I think, an expression of grace that makes us most human. It's something that is a particular legacy of many indigenous communities. that insist that no individual lives alone, and that, again, that the living and the dead are bound together, that we will inevitably make mistakes and not immediately jump on one another because of those mistakes, but at the same time hold one another to high ethical standards. And that work of repair seems to require doing both, that hard critical work of self-examination and listening and arguing with one another, and not just saying we're not going to go down those roads, but also being willing to be open to the possibility of the transformation of the self and the transformation of the other, and the understanding that in partnership we can actually reach somewhere together that we could never get on our own. That's our only hope. It seems in an era in which we are terribly polarized and divided through what cable news or social media feed we're on, it seems almost impossible to imagine sometime. But it is our only hope, that small, quiet commitment to listening and learning and transformation. That's our only route to salvation.
Well, congratulations to your dad, who's in the audience. I always like to acknowledge the elders. You did a really good job. But in terms of just, I think we've got like 1 second. Hey, look, 40,000 acres was patented to Piscataway people for reservations. We don't have anything at all. So it's a sense of not just of return to consciousness, return to right relationship. It is not only, you cannot have reconciliation if there is still harm being done. You cannot apologize if if there is still harm actively being done. And it's not just to, indigenous people. I mean, at this point, we're connected to everybody. We're all here. We're all here. And everything that is happening in terms of what is still happening on the land, and now where we're having the pullbacks of what the protections of the land, which were so hard won. Whoever thought they would see a bald eagle in D.C.? Well, there are bald eagles in D.C., and there's a reason for that. It's because people worked really, really hard for that, right? That we can have this conversation. We all worked really, really hard. Our ancestors worked really, really hard so that you could come and have this conversation, so that you could, acknowledge the complexities of history, and for you to be able to engage in this incredibly profound set of dialogue, inspiring questions in this space, which is brought up. So I think in the sense of reconciliation and reparations, stop, it's really basic, stop with the harm, then look at how do we restore the land, and how do we do that together. We can't do that separately.
That,
basic.
Thank you, is a perfect place to stop, but I hope not end this dialogue. Thank you each for being a catalyst to further discussion, and I hope for all of us to further learning and listening to the land, listening to the earth, and listening to one another. I invite you downstairs for the 4 o'clock program on the legacy of 400 years after the arrival of Point Comfort.